Thank you for listening to this download of Start the Week, presented by Anne McElvoy.
Hello. A spectre stalks the programme today, the ghostly trail of Karl Marx, recast from the 19th century frock coat for the era of solar power and the DIY website, and the rise of a powerful new force. Yes, us, the prosumers. If that description doesn't ring a bell with you, you might still be one of this new breed, sharing everything from homes to big ideas, bypassing big companies to acquire goods cheaply, or even making them yourself. So might Marx's prediction that capitalism is doomed to shatter under the weight of its own contradictions have a fresh resonance in these high-tech times. Marx might also have applauded the thinking of another of my guests today, who will tell us why she thinks the glittering prize of a fast-growing global economy is secured at the cost of a large number of people expelled from its benefits. Joining me to work out whether capitalism is on its knees or still seeing off the challenges are Kwasi Kwarteng, the Conservative MP and author of a new book on the dizzy highs and scary lows of international finance, Saskia Sassen, Professor of Sociology at Columbia University, and Jeremy Rifkin, whose latest work takes a hard look at the consequences for economic markets of all those free internet downloads and what might follow. Jeremy, your book is called The Zero Marginal Cost Society, the Internet of Things, the Collaborative Commons and the Eclipse of Capitalism. You've packed quite a lot in there, haven't you?
Absolutely.
This is a vision of capitalism on the wane. Why?
Let me put this in context. What I think's happening is we're just beginning to glimpse the bare outlines of a new economic system entering onto the world stage, the collaborative commons. This is the first new economic system to emerge since the advent of capitalism and socialism in the early 19th century. So it's a remarkable historical event, and it has tremendous implications for all of us in terms of our day-to-day economic lives over the next few years and decades. The precipitating agent that's responsible for this great economic transformation afoot is something called zero marginal cost. Now, don't be frightened. Marginal cost is the cost of producing an additional unit of a good or service once your fixed costs are covered. Let me explain. There is a paradox deeply embedded in the heart of the capitalist system, previously undisclosed, even by Karl Marx, I should say. But this paradox has led to the great success of capitalism. Ironically, it's this very success that's now leading to its potential demise and this new economy that's emerging, the collaborative commons. In a capitalist market, sellers are always trying to find new technologies that can increase their productivity, reduce their marginal costs, so they can put out cheaper products, win over consumers, and bring some profits back to their investors. It's simply that no business person or economist ever anticipated in their wildest imagination a technology revolution so extreme in its productivity that it could actually reduce those marginal costs to near zero, making goods nearly free, abundant, and no longer subject to the market. And that's
if people
what's
are
happening.
thinking, well, I still seem to be paying quite a lot for my goods and services one way or another, give me an example of an area where this is having a real impact on the way we consume.
Zero marginal cost phenomena invaded the information good industries in the last 15 years, and this is going to be very familiar to everyone. Hundreds of millions of consumers became prosumers with the internet. And they began to produce and share their own information goods. Young people started sharing their own music. And
so they're producer-consumers. They're doing both at once.
They're doing both. So millions of young people began to produce and share their own music, their own videos. They began to produce and share their own news blogs. They even started putting out their own free e-books. This has devastated traditional powerful industries. The recording industry has been crippled. Newspapers have gone out of business. Magazines have bellied up. And my own industry, publishing, is on the rack. And that's because millions of people now are producing and sharing their own information goods at near zero marginal cost. Now, what's really happening now is the zero marginal cost is now moving from information goods in the virtual world to physical goods and physical services, and that's what's going to change the equation.
So why would I think that it's going to affect physical goods when I can sort of see how it works in information technology, but it's pretty difficult to think of me sitting at home manufacturing something out of my computer, at least for the foreseeable future.
What's beginning to emerge in the last 2 years is something called the Internet of Things. The information internet we're all familiar with is now expanding into a bigger internet. It's converging with the emerging energy internet and now a nascent automated transport and logistics internet. So we're starting to think of three internets in one platform.
So when you talk about the energy internet, you mean trading, making your own energy, solar energy or something, and then I trade mine with yours and we bypass the big five energy companies.
We bypass the market altogether. What's happening now is sensors are being connected from these three internets across the economic system. So we have sensors connecting resource flows, factory floors, vehicles, appliances, smart roads, warehouses. And we're starting to connect everyone into one big internet, communication, energy, and transport. And this allows anyone potentially to come into this network, any of us, with our own mobiles and our own apps, and we can take the big data coming through this system, use analytics, and create our own algorithms to produce our own goods and services at very low marginal cost, bypassing the capitalist market.
Thank you. I mean, it was very interesting. I mean, I was particularly fascinated to read about Germany, where you were saying that some of these ideas with regard to the energy market, because obviously in Britain there's been a big political debate with regard to rising energy costs. But you were suggesting, I think, in your book that people in Germany had sort of taken things into their own hands.
It's very interesting. You know, I've been advising Chancellor Merkel since she came into office, and it's been a real success story in Germany. Right now, we have millions of people in Germany that have their own solar panels. They've installed them on their roofs. They have their own wind turbines. They have their own geothermal heat pumps. And 25% of the electricity now in Germany is renewable energy. And guess who's producing it? Millions of small players, producer co-ops, consumer co-ops, farmers, households. And what's interesting is you have to pay for the technology. But once that technology's in, the solar panel or the wind turbine, the marginal cost of producing the energy is free because the sun off your roof is free, the wind off your property
Jerry,
is free.
I mean, Germany is a very good example. You put a very positive spin on that, but there's a lot of people in Germany, including actually this new coalition that you built, that say this has sort of driven up costs. It's had to be ridiculously subsidised. And if anything, there's a bit of a move back from it. So might it not be that two of these things are going on at once, one which leads you to the active prosumer that you describe in your book, and at the same time you have a desire really for things not to go in that direction because it's also quite hard to get other economies out of that model.
Yeah, it's very disruptive. What's happened now is sometimes the cost of electricity is nearly negative prices. At noon, you have so much solar and wind coming into the grid, you have negative prices. Now, the reason prices have gone up to the consumer is the utility companies are passing the cost on in putting this infrastructure to their ratepayers. So the wholesale prices are way down, retail prices are up, but it's a hump. Once we get over that hump, Germany's going to be producing green electricity at near zero marginal cost, and that's a huge, dramatic increase in productivity.
Saskia, we'll come on to your book in a moment, but do you see a rise in this sharing society that Jeremy has outlined for us?
Yes, I do. I mean, it is still a minor part of most of our societies, but I think it really matters. And sort of my interest in examining these zones of expulsion, you know, where people are really dropped by our system. That means that the question then becomes, you know, how do they organize livelihood? How do they make economies? So I find this, you are looking at it inside, right, a system, a working system. I'm trying to understand what happens when you're actually really out. And I'm not just talking about poor countries. I'm also talking about our rich countries.
We might follow that up. We will follow that up in a moment. But, Jeremy, the question that I have, really, there have been many different ways of telling the story that capitalism is in some ways bust. It's reached the end. Its internal contradictions have brought it to its knees. And yet, strangely, this funny old beast, rackety old beast sometimes, does seem to struggle on. Do you not think that the zero marginal cost argument might end up going the same way, that the reason entrepreneurs are entrepreneurs is they do find ways to create new value when other people say, you're finished now, industrial production's going to finish you off, or something, technology's going to finish you off?
I didn't think I'd see in my lifetime a new economic system emerge. You know, I taught the advanced management program at the Wharton School for a long, long time, and I think all of us were convinced that capitalism was here to stay. No longer. And I'll tell you why I think that. It's the success of the capitalist system that's actually breeding this new technology, which is undermining it. And, you can take a look at the recording industry. They didn't see, when young people started file sharing music and sharing with each other, the recording industry tried to stop it. They tried to legislate it. Then they went out of business. And in the media industry, the newspapers and magazines and book publishing were very powerful. But when millions of people were able, because
The
they were
point
no longer
being, though,
in
Jeremy,
the system, to create their own system,
they do reinvent
did.
themselves. It has not driven every publisher out of business. It's not even driven every newspaper out of
but
business.
here's the rub. Early on, industry analysts would say, okay, there's a lot of free information out there, freemiums. But the freemiums will then stimulate people to want to buy the premiums, so there's new opportunities for the capitalist system. So, for example, the New York Times will say, we'll give you 20 free articles a month, freemiums, and then we hope it'll entice you to buy the subscription, the premiums. Or a musician will say, we'll give our music out free, you come to our concerts and pay. On any big scale, this hasn't happened because the more free goods and services available, the less people are willing to then pay for them. We want
What
them for
about
free.
the collaborative commons, though?
Yeah.
Give me a bit more an example about... Now, you mentioned Germany, and I might really want to quarrel with you about the energy example, but let's move away from that because it's quite specific. A government kind of went for it at a particular time. In a way, you had a policy commitment to it. How might it work out in our lives if it's not something that's government-led, if it's just something that arises bottom-up? Give me a collaborative commons I could take part in.
My economist colleagues believe there's only two ways to manage an economy, either private enterprise or government or some combination between the two, capitalism, socialism, or social market economy. They forget that there's a third economy in our lives that all of us are engaged in that provides a whole range of goods and services that aren't part of the private enterprise or government. It's called the social economy, the civil society. And this is where millions of nonprofit organizations, small and large, are attending to the most intimate affairs of our life, educational institutions, healthcare services, environmental groups, sports, arts, etc.
OK, but now give me an example where that, in the jargon, the third sector, where does that lead me into collaborative commons that I don't know about already? I mean, people have been running schools out in that way for a very, very long time.
I'll give you some examples. Yeah. We now have literally hundreds of millions of people who have actually begun to transfer some of their economic activity to the collaborative commons. They're not just sharing information goods and video and audio and text and energy and now 3D printed products that they make in their own homes or offices. They're now sharing cars. Young people would rather have access to mobility with a nonprofit car sharing service than buy an automobile. And for every car that's shared, 15 automobiles aren't purchased. That's a huge change in the capitalist system. Or take homes and apartments. A lot of the people, as you mentioned before, that are on the outside of the system are now finding value. They have their apartments. They're paying their rent. So it's only marginal cost for them to rent out their apartment to somebody else and bypass the hotel system altogether. So we are seeing a titanic shift outside the capitalist system to the sharing economy. And I agree it's early, but it portends some tremendous disruptions over the long run.
But I found your book fascinating. But surely one of the things that I came up with was the fact that this marginal cost going to zero argument, near zero, is very similar. I mean, it's very similar to the circumstances of perfect competition as described by Adam Smith 200 years ago, where he was saying that if you have enough competition, the profit goes to zero. And I was just thinking that maybe all this just makes the capitalist system more efficient. It doesn't necessarily mean that it'll be replaced.
Well, actually, I'll tell you let you in a little story, and maybe he'll respond. Larry Summers, the former U.S. Secretary of Treasury and president of Harvard University, he and Bradford DeLong, an economist, they began to understand the implications of this after the dot-com bust in 2001. And the Kansas City Federal Reserve Board held a meeting to discuss this new concept of near zero marginal cost. And Larry Summers got up in a presentation, I don't know if he's listening right now, and he said, we've got a problem here because the most efficient economy is the one that runs at near zero marginal cost. But now with the new information technologies, they are moving to near zero marginal cost, which is the most efficient economy. Here's the problem. Once you get to near zero marginal cost, you can't make a profit. Therefore, it's the end of capitalism. So Larry Summers actually advocates in this speech that we have temporary monopolies because that's the only way to get the cost above marginal cost so capitalism can survive. He said otherwise there's going to have to be a new economic paradigm. We don't know what it'll be. Well, Mr. Summers, I know what it is. It's called the collaborative commons.
He's got the answer. And yet we heard on the news just before we come on the programme, a big takeover on the cards in the pharmaceutical sector. Pfizer looking at taking over AstraZeneca. So it still seems to be that these big companies are powering ahead. Who really suffers then? Is it the big companies or is it the ones in the middle?
Capitalism is not going to disappear. What I suspect is going to happen is more and more of our economic life, especially for those who are marginalized by the system, is going to move into this collaborative commons. By mid-century, some of the big global companies will survive as powerful niche players because they're going to aggregate some of the networks that are very technical. But they will no longer be the exclusive arbiter of economic life because a lot of it's going to move toward the social commons.
Competition from ordinary people in groups, but enabled through
I'm going to
the
give you an
internet.
example right now today on the front page of the Financial Times, and that is there's a discussion now in France about a sellout where Alstom will be put together with Siemens, so they'll have both a great energy transmission company together with a transport. Well, those are two of the three internets, the energy internet and the transport internet. And so we need to be careful that as these monopolies, potential monopolies come about, that we ensure network neutrality, that we ensure regulations and authorities so that this new Internet of Things is on behalf of the people and not a handful of institutions.
The new holy trinity, perhaps. So, where Jeremy foresees sharing and collaboration, Saskia, in your new book, Expulsions, Brutality and Complexity in the Global Economy, you foresee divisions, or see already divisions, inequality, and people marginalised and excluded. And yet, for as long as anyone can remember, this has been the story of an often unfair world. What's different now?
Yeah, well, absolutely. Every time we have economic development, we have significant destructions and expulsions. My starting point is really two issues. One is, why is it that complex forms of knowledge that we admire and respect so often produce elementary brutalities, not even grand brutalities? I find that very interesting when you have the 100+ physicists in the back room where the secretaries used to sit of Goldman Sachs, developing extraordinary algorithms, which then get deployed in electronic financial markets and produce massive destructions, often of a little kind. One thing is a grand...
But do you mean destructions, or do you mean sort of disruptions to the way things were before? Because
that too.
Dear old
But
Schumpeter and his the way that he sees
Absolutely.
capitalism destroying
Absolutely.
as it creates.
No, I am just interested in a very specific aspect of this. So thanks for bringing that up. And that is the extreme condition. Not just, your average, whatever, the little shop is replaced by a chain of shops. But I am really interested in the extreme condition. And here what I see is a set of logics of destruction that are operating on a scale that is really all-producing, I must say. And the other issue that hangs in there for me is that there is a kind of a multiplication of systemic edges. This has nothing to do with the borders, but sort of once you cross that line, whether you are a worker, a neighborhood, a place, a small firm, that the fact that you've been destroyed becomes invisible. So we have a large number of extreme conditions that are visible. So at one point they are visible, and then, now this is the theorist in me also, and then they become invisible. So when thousands of small owners, small farmers in India commit suicide because their little farm is dying, you know what? That does not get counted in the statistics. When we destroy vast stretches of land and water bodies, none of our maps shows that. We pretend that all that territory is still there, that all those oceans look so blue, etc. There is death. So these are really extreme conditions I'm interested
I'm tempted
in.
to say it is being so cheerful as keeps you going.
Yeah, really.
Now, come on.
I am smiling here with a big smile.
You are actually a very cheerful person. And yet the narrative that you have in this book is that capitalism, at least this hyper-capitalism, turbocharged capitalism that we have at the moment, destroys, it displaces. Right. At the same time, you have another view, really, don't you, that a lot of the world's poorest people have got a lot richer in recent years, that many of them actually want to leave the land and go to the cities. So in a way, you're fighting against what people want to do.
No, I'm not fighting with them. I'm just observing. No. I totally, with the China bit, my argument vis-a-vis China is I don't deny that there is growth. That is the issue, you see. We have some very robust growth rates. And even when you look at economies that are in trouble, like the American economy, in subsectors, you have finance has had impressive rates of profit making, etc. Right? So my point is precisely what happens in the shadows of all of this growth? And so China, we think that China is the future. And my question here becomes, what is more significant actually in shaping the emergent new phase we're moving into? Is it the growth of China, which is moreover stagnating, but it was a very significant growth and it continues to be stagnating, or is it actually how we are engaging in sort of foundational destructions? Like dead land and dead water is a good example of that. But so are the millions of
dead land and dead water, if you just gloss what that means for us.
Toxic destruction because of mining or because of growing palm or the way we kill land in the United States because we don't rotate crops. I mean, you name it. It's a very long list. But at the same time, I have to finish this one. But at the same time, you see, we are also generating whole new built environments, visual orders that tell a tale which might not be the full tale, and that is, again, a confusion.
Can you give me an example of that?
For example, well, look at the new parts of Dubai, not the old Dubai. The old Dubai is horrible. But people stand in awe at this Venice, where you go with a little boat. Stunning new architecture in all of our cities, including in London. And so there is a visual order that speaks a language of it all is getting better. It is all getting better. And I must say, in the 1980s, late 1980s, I was saying we're headed towards growing inequality, but the visual order in our cities was one of growth, prosperity, and a vaster expanse of state-of-the-art architecture and infrastructure.
And you don't buy the argument that more people feel that they are gaining than losing?
No, too many people. No. We only hear the chattering classes, and the chattering classes go by the waves of. So in the 1990s, everybody was rejecting my argument of inequality. Now everybody suddenly is talking inequality. So,
Yes, I think there is a return of the inequality theme, isn't there? Including in even the big beasts and financial organisations. When I was in Davos earlier in the year at the World Economic Forum, this theme of inequality was being talked about. Now, Saskia, to an extent, blames the complexity of financial instruments. I think you're a former city analyst. I don't know if you want to defend your former
I think it was
breed.
Quite interesting what Saskia was saying, because it seems to me that Jeremy and Saskia are arguing two slightly different things. On the one hand, we're saying that profitability is zero marginal cost means that capitalism is, facing a crisis in that profit is under threat. And at the other, what Saskia's saying is, I think that capitalism is almost too powerful, because you're saying that, when I read your book, it seemed to me that concentrations of money and power were what were forcing other people into the edges. So in a way, it's an interesting thing where you're saying that on the one hand, capitalism is under attack because profits are massively under attack, whereas on the other, you're saying that accumulations of capital and concentrations of capital mean that people are being driven out into the margins of society.
I know, but everything, that's right, but it is a curve, and once you're on the other side of the curve, you're in trouble. So if there is too much concentration of profit, and especially when it's financial, when you think of the value of outstanding derivatives, a quadrillion.
Sure.
That's a lot of zeros. That does not exist, that
Please,
money.
you said you didn't ask me to say how many.
May I say how this, I think, comes together, what both of you are saying, that on the one hand, there is a huge amount of profit going on, and we have, 500 global companies whose revenue now equals 1/3 of the GDP of the world. That's astounding. On the other hand, what we're seeing is that millions of people now, under the radar screen, are opting out of that system onto this collaborative commons. And you know how you can measure it? The slow rate of GDP. GDP is slowing in its rate. Now, why? It's because there are some things that aren't measured. As millions of people move on to this collaborative commons, let's say, for example, they're prosumers and they're producing and sharing their own goods at near zero marginal cost free. That's not counted in GDP. As millions of people began to access their automobiles and car share them rather than buying them, or they lease out their apartments rather than owning them, this isn't counted in the GDP. Or when people are recycling their clothes and their tools and toys, so they have 9 lives, they're buying less, and more people are consuming fewer things. None of this is in the GDP, but it changes the metric to quality of life, and that's the new system that's emerging.
Why can't it do so to help the people who's just coming back to you, Saskia.
Yeah.
Now, is there not potential, as we've seen in a lot of areas, in developing economies are very good and very inventive and often quick at bypassing some rather inefficient things that the rich world has done?
Yeah.
Why can the groups that you're describing not, in a sense, benefit from what Jeremy is describing? Because collaborative commons could work possibly well there too.
I think that is happening. I totally agree that this is an extremely important move, and it is truly, it might be the beginning of a far more complex history than the way we look at it now, which is, sharing your, using your hotel also to rent out room. I mean, your hotel, I stay in so many hotels that
using your house,
sharing your house to share. So, but the issue that I am particularly interested in is the scale of the logics of destruction, which I see as partly a function of the extraordinarily complex forms of knowledge that we have, some benign and some not benign, but most of them admirable forms of knowledge. Yet we wind up with too many destructions, too many scale downs, too many areas of the world where you have just devastations. Now, right here in London, you have all kinds of expulsions happening. This is happening at the center of our big cities. I'm not just talking about the refugees.
Give us an example of. It's a very strong word, expulsions.
It is, right. And glad you bring that up. So I think that we are, as I said earlier, on the other side of the curve. We need to know analytics. The language of more inequality, more poverty, more displacement, more environmental destruction. At what point do we stand back and say, more is not enough? Because as long as you say more, there is a sense it's happening inside a system and we can readjust. I am saying there are breaking points, and these breaking points are multiplying. They're happening right here in London. They're happening in the global south in refugee camps. Those displaced people are never going home because home is a war zone.
But you see, when you use the word expulsions, and let's talk about London if we could, just to narrow it in.
Yes.
People would say, well, if you mean can people not afford to live in the centre anymore? Are they moving out? Are they under pressure financially because the capital is expensive? Well, the answer is probably undoubtedly yes.
Yes.
And yet it still has this pull and attraction. So it doesn't feel like this expulsion is sort of the end of life as they know it. It means something has changed.
Well, yes and no. For some, yes, but I can assure you that there are a lot of young professionals which have good educations who are losing their jobs and not getting jobs back, who are struggling to make a living. What I'm trying to say is that these expulsions does not necessarily mean that you have been thrown out of the country. That is why this is not geographic borders. This is something that happens inside. You have too many young people who are not getting jobs. You have multiple micro-histories. And so my question is, do we need a language that captures the fact of, the relentlessness of some of these processes and the fact that more and more people are being affected? And secondly, a temporal dimension, and that is that many of those people will never have a job.
Very quick.
Very quick, but I'd like to move on it a little bit more seriously later on. Nowhere is the impact of near zero marginal cost more impressive than with the new technologies and dealing with employment, automation, AI, algorithms. They're literally eliminating jobs across the border. We're going to near zero marginal cost labor, and so what we're seeing here is a migration to a new form of employment on the collaborative commons. Millions of people are now migrating from the market where they've been expelled into the collaborative commons, where they're creating new ways to employ each other on the social commons.
So are you more optimistic than Saskia sounded?
I'm guardedly optimistic because I can see that the social economy, the employment's been going up in the last 15 years, a growth of 42%. GDP's been growing at 14% in the traditional economy. So watch the job migration as people become involved in what we call creating social capital, not market capital.
I love the phrase guardedly optimistic. I think you've covered yourself very well there. Kwasi, your book is entitled War and Gold. What a swashbuckling title that is for a book on the present state of capitalism. We've talked there a bit, and Saskia reflected a bit about the brilliance, but as she saw it, rather destructive brilliance of international finance. Is there anything that we can learn? Your book is about the history and also the present of international finance. Is there anything that we can learn from that, and also the crisis of 2008, which guides us forward through these marches?
Well, my book talks about a thing which we haven't mentioned at all, actually, in the previous discussion. I talk about the role of government. government spending.
Government.
Yeah,
Right.
that little thing.
Yes.
And as a politician, I suppose I'm quite I spend a lot of time thinking about government and government spending and currencies and crises. And generally, I think I would agree with a number of things, not everything that has been said, but clearly, we do have a problem with massive asset bubbles, which skew returns to people who have capital. What my book is essentially looking at the way in which government spending, in terms of war and gold, which is what currencies used to be backed on, have created this sort of very unstable situation. And one of the things that I argue is about, since we left the gold standard finally in 1971, we've got paper currencies, essentially. We've got fiat money. And a lot of the problems, I think, that are described...
Fiat money being money where we mainly trust that the value that it says on the note is somehow backed up mysteriously.
That's right. And central banks essentially just print money. And I think in that sort of environment, you do get a slightly more skewed version of capitalism where people who have access to credit, people who have access to this paper money can buy assets and force up prices. And it's slightly whereas in previous capitalism, it was very much more a sort of solid physical thing. So the Victorian capitalist had a factory and he got a return, 5% return, and a sort of gold-backed currency.
That's reflected a bit in what Jeremy was saying earlier about the shift from things that you can actually perceive or say there is the value
Absolutely
to things
right.
that you can't.
So with war and gold, I mean, and one of the drivers I say in the book is the fact that if you look historically, and that's what I am, I'm not a theorist, I'm trained as a historian, governments essentially have printed money to finance war. That's so gold standards end when governments have to fight wars, they print money, and then we create this sort of slightly more unstable situation. That's one of the arguments.
But clear this up for me, because we have had wars and governments have fought expensive wars in recent years, but they weren't the proximate cause of the crisis of 2007-8.
In a funny way, they were, because one of the reasons, and I talk about this a lot, 2008 was basically the conclusion of a period of very low interest rates, which was started really as a consequence of 9/11. And what happens with very low interest rates is that bankers and people want to get higher yields, because if they lend to the US government, they can only get about 1.5% for 10-year money. And so the search for yield, it's a phrase, meant that very clever financiers devised instruments which gave more yield. So mortgage-backed securities, the credit derivatives that Saskia was talking about. These were very much driven by this low interest rate environment because bankers wanted higher yields. They wanted higher interest rates, and the interest rates were very low. And that, as I describe in the book, creates a lot of instability because we created all this paper, and of course, in the end, the mortgages...
But isn't there a tension, particularly if you're arguing from a sort of position of loosely a freedom of markets,
Sure.
which is saying, well, these brilliant instruments are being invented, and then we look back, we find the ones we don't like, and you say, that was brilliant, but we didn't like that one.
Sure.
To what extent can we only see subsequently the things that we thought were a calculated risk at the time, and without basically closing down a lot of the financial
Sure.
sector, it would be very difficult to know what to constrain.
You mentioned Schumpeter earlier and sort of creative destruction. I mean, clearly, there's no way we can work out the safety or the way in which these instruments work beforehand. We sort of learn our lessons by experience. That doesn't mean that, we made some big mistakes with regard to regulation. And people always say, well, you're a free market man. Why do you want more regulation? It's not more regulation. It's the quality of the regulation. So there were rules, but the rules weren't actually being followed and they weren't being policed. And if you're in a situation like that,
as well as the regulation.
It's the culture completely.
Yeah, and now we know that there is actually violation of the law.
Yes,
we don't need to go into... I mean, London was one of the sites, so it was many American
Okay, but in a way, that's
right.
a kind of easier
right.
answer.
Exactly,
isn't it?
but I think that something else happens. I agree with everything that you said, but I would add another significant factor, and that is, for instance, that when a bank is really a financial bank, loans, you mentioned it vis-à-vis the government, but it also happens vis-à-vis all the small businesses that need loans. Banks do not want to loan. So we in the United States, we the citizens of the United States, we were not asked, but we have been giving $15 billion every month, now it's down to $10 billion, to the big banks. A few limited number of big banks. Now, those banks were then meant to make loans to millions of small enterprises that depend on small loans just to get their production process going. Well, the big banks, they didn't even consider making loans because making loans is, like you said, not a way to make profits. So what happens is they sit on all our real cash as opposed to fictive money. And they then develop frequent instruments that create hyper profits. And that is the massive distortion. So the smallholder economy dies slowly. And the super profits are based on some sort of fictitious...
Jeremy thinks it rises again with the...
Well, what happens
it's a
is,
different
what
kind
we're saying is that those who have been marginalized out, and the rest of us, the middle class, are moving toward this collaborative commons where we're reinventing economic life.
Yes,
we're beginning to produce and share our own goods and services at near zero marginal cost, and we're bypassing the profit-driven marketplace. It's only the beginning. Sure. And you could certainly say that capitalism is strong, but it's very vulnerable. These big global corporations that are vertically integrated, their profit margins in some of these industries are very low. So if 10% of the population begins to move toward these lateral collaborative commons at zero marginal cost, it devastates big companies. And we saw this with the recording industry, newspapers, magazines. It's going to be no different with energy and 3D
I must
products.
come back to Kwasi. What about government? As you say, you're interested in government, you're a serving MP, but you're also looking at the role of government. You seem to take a pretty dim view of the wisdom of governments when it comes to accumulating debt. It sounds a bit like living with your high-spending uncle who tends to go off and blow it all on the horses as soon as you go out for the day.
But I think this is a fundamental problem which Jeremy and Saskia's sort of world needs to address, because we have, certainly in the West, governments which have been chronically overspending, in the sense that, if you look at Japan, they're ratcheting up huge amounts of debt. They run deficits every year. The US is recovering, but still has this very, very big burden of debt. And across Western Europe, we have a similar problem. And I think the way in which, Jeremy talked about the future of capitalism. A very important aspect of this future of capitalism is the future of the welfare state and the future of the kind of the government.
But if you say
to
might say to your colleague George Osborne, you might set deficit debt reduction targets, but there is often reason, doesn't it, in terms of the electoral cycle, but also because you want to do the right thing by people, why you keep borrowing. Now, maybe to try and stimulate the economy, maybe to keep unemployment down. It's not an unimportant part of government that even politicians, or more of the right of centre, can end up borrowing. Do you see this as being something that's very hard to keep a lid on?
Yes, I think it is. But I think what I've found very interesting in the last sort of 4 or 5 years is that both the two main parties have given their own deficit reduction schedules. Now, the argument that the Conservatives had with Labour was never one which said we should never eliminate the deficit. The question was all about the speed at which the deficit was reduced. But both parties regarded the deficit as a problem.
But employment lurks somewhere here, doesn't it? Because the reason often you can't, or governments aren't prepared to sort of take the very, very strong measures, they are always worried about rises in unemployment. And as Jeremy and I think to an extent Saskia outlined, things that are changing put extra pressure on that. I think there's a commitment to pitch towards full employment in Britain by the Chancellor at the moment. Does that sound remotely realistic to the table?
Here's the real problem. It's the reason we are seeing more debt is because the second industrial revolution is now sunsetting. Fossil fuel energies are too expensive and the whole world runs by them. All of our products are made by them, our construction materials, our fertilizers, our pharmaceuticals, our power. And so when you reach a point where your energy regime is now tanking and the technologies based on them are moribund, like internal combustion engines, centralized electricity, you can't get any more productivity or growth. So the only thing you can do is go into more debt and create a fictional economy. And the reason the economy went down in 2008 is never talked about. It's because that month of July 2008, oil hit $147 a barrel. Right. All the prices for everything else went up, and purchasing power shut down. Then 2 months later, the fictional economy went down, the financial market, because they couldn't maintain the fiction of a credit economy.
Right, but I want to come back up to date and ask you, briefly, if you could, on the last round, is really what do modern politicians, left, right, wherever they are, do about this? We have all these factors, Jeremy's just raised a couple of them there, which seem to overwhelm democratically elected politicians.
I think that there needs to be, certainly across the Western world, there needs to be more honesty amongst sort of public people in terms of what the actual problems that we're facing. Because Jeremy's quite right. We have an old industrial model which was relying on certain amounts of productivity and certain amounts of growth, which we're not really reaching at the moment. And this is a fundamental problem. If the growth isn't as strong as it used to be, for various reasons, and our spending goes up in the same way, we've got a problem here. We've got to try and adjust our governments and adjust the way we run things.
Saskia, if I were to, we'll just do that one quickly. Saskia, if I were to say to you, how do you see this new economic system? How do you see the future of capitalism? If you could just stick it in a nutshell, what would it sound like?
Well, I think that powerful actors like the financial system don't govern themselves well, and they're engaged in self-destruction as well. And I think there are two foundational issues that have not been sufficiently alluded to here. One of them is that all our states are getting poorer. The exception is China, etc. But Germany, people focus on Japan and on the United States, but Germany also has tripled its government debt. The question is, why are all our states today, on our advanced states today, unable to do what they did after World War I, which is rebuild vast infrastructures, etc., and they can't do it today.
It might sound like a fairly depressing nostrum there, Kwasi. When you look to the future of capitalism, what do you see?
Well, I think what Jeremy said in terms of rebooting the way we do our industry in terms of the capitalist system, I think is quite interesting, because clearly the old model is suffering, because, as you say, we're not getting enough productivity, we're not getting enough growth to pay for the things we want to do as a government. The welfare state, the social provision that we all want. So I think there's a big tension there. I'm not sure that capitalism in itself will be abolished and a new economic system will be built. But clearly, we've got to think more innovatively about how we generate profits.
But let's mention the grand larceny of the corporations that don't pay taxes.
Let's be clear about the companies. Near zero marginal cost is extreme productivity. It means no profits anymore, but it's the best economic state you could have.
There we must leave the future of capitalism still up for grabs. Thanks to all my guests. Jeremy Rifkin's The Zero Marginal Cost Society is out now. Saskia Sassen's Expulsions and Kwasi Kwarteng's War and Gold. All available soon next week. Vengeance and Retribution, as I discuss Greek tragedy and today's morality with Simon Armitage, Natalie Haynes, Frank McGuinness and Kenan Malik. But for now, thank you and goodbye.
There's more information about Start the Week on the programme's website. Go to bbc.co.uk, where you'll also find many more Radio 4 programmes you can download for free. Thank you for listening to this download of Start the Week, presented by Anne McElvoy.
Hello, a spectre stalks the programme today, The Ghostly Trail of Karl Marx, recast from the 19th century frock coat for the era of solar power and the DIY website, and the rise of a powerful new force. Yes, us, the prosumers. If that description doesn't ring a bell with you, you might still be one of this new breed, sharing everything from homes to big ideas, bypassing big companies to acquire goods cheaply, or even making them yourself. So might Marx's prediction that capitalism is doomed to shatter under the weight of its own contradictions have a fresh resonance in these high-tech times. Marx might also have applauded the thinking of another of my guests today, who will tell us why she thinks the glittering prize of a fast-growing global economy is secured at the cost of a large number of people expelled from its benefits. Joining me to work out whether capitalism is on its knees or still seeing off the challengers are Kwasi Kwarteng, the Conservative MP and author of a new book on the dizzy highs and scary lows of international finance, Saskia Sassen, Professor of Sociology at Columbia University, and Jeremy Rifkin, whose latest work takes a hard look at the consequences for economic markets of all those free internet downloads and what might follow. Jeremy, your book is called The Zero Marginal Cost Society, the Internet of Things, the Collaborative Commons and the Eclipse of Capitalism. You've packed quite a lot in there, haven't you?
Absolutely. Its productivity, they could actually reduce those marginal costs to near zero, making goods nearly free, abundant, and no longer subject to the market. And that's
if people
what's
are
happening.
thinking, well, I still seem to be paying quite a lot for my goods and services one way or another, give me an example of an area where this is having a real impact on the way we consume.
Zero marginal cost phenomena invaded the information good industries in the last 15 years, and this is going to be very familiar to everyone. hundreds of millions of consumers became prosumers with the internet. And they began to produce and share their own information goods. Young people started sharing their own music. And
so they're producer-consumers. They're doing both at once.
They're doing both. So millions of young people began to produce and share their own music, their own videos. They began to produce and share their own news blogs. They even started putting out their own free e-books. This has devastated traditional powerful industries. The recording industry has been crippled. Newspapers have gone out of business. Magazines have bellied up. And my own industry, publishing, is on the rack. And that's because millions of people now are producing and sharing their own information goods at near zero marginal cost. Now, what's really happening now is the zero marginal cost is now moving from information goods in the virtual world to physical goods and physical services, and that's what's going to change the equation.
So why would I think that it's going to affect physical goods when I can sort of see how it works in information technology, but it's pretty difficult to think of me sitting at home.
People in Germany had sort of taken things into their own hands.
It's very interesting. You know, I've been advising Chancellor Merkel since she came into office, and it's been a real success story in Germany. Right now, we have millions of people in Germany that have their own solar panels. They've installed them on their roofs. They have their own wind turbines. They have their own geothermal heat pumps. And 25% of the of the electricity now in Germany is renewable energy. And guess who's producing it? Millions of small players, producer co-ops, consumer co-ops, farmers, households. And what's interesting is you have to pay for the technology. But once that technology's in, the solar panel or the wind turbine, the marginal cost of producing the energy is free because the sun off your roof is free, the wind off your property
Jerry,
is free.
I mean, Germany is a very good example. You put a very positive spin on that, but there's a lot of people in Germany, including actually this new coalition that you built, that say this has sort of driven up costs. It's had to be ridiculously subsidised, and if anything, there's a bit of a move back from it. So might it not be that two of these things are going on at once, one which leads you to the active prosumer that you describe in your book, and at the same time you have a desire really for things not to go in that direction because it's also quite hard to get other economies out of that model.
Yeah, it's very disruptive. What's happened now is sometimes the cost of electricity is nearly negative prices. At noon, you have so much solar and wind coming into the grid, you have negative prices. Now, the reason prices are
manufacturing something out of my computer, at least for the foreseeable future.
What's beginning to emerge in the last 2 years is something called the Internet of Things. The information internet we're all familiar with is now expanding into a bigger internet. It's converging with the emerging energy internet and now a nascent automated transport and logistics internet. So we're starting to think of three internets in one platform.
So when you talk about the energy internet, you mean trading, making your own energy, solar energy or something, and then I trade mine with yours and we bypass the big five energy companies.
We bypass the market altogether. What's happening now is sensors are being connected from these three internets across the economic system. So we have sensors connecting resource flows, factory floors, vehicles, appliances, smart roads, warehouses. And we're starting to connect everyone into one big internet, communication, energy, and transport. And this allows anyone potentially to come into this network, any of us, with our own mobiles and our own apps, and we can take the big data coming through this system, use analytics, and create our own algorithms to produce our own goods and services at very low marginal cost, bypassing the capitalist market.
Thank you. I mean, it was very interesting. I mean, I was particularly fascinated to read about Germany, where you were saying that some of these ideas with regard to the energy market, because obviously in Britain there's been a big political debate with regard to rising energy costs. But you were suggesting, I think, in your book that...
This is a vision of capitalism on the wane. Why?
Let me put this in context. What I think's happening is we're just beginning to glimpse the bare outlines of a new economic system entering onto the world stage, the collaborative commons. This is the first new economic system to emerge since the advent of capitalism and socialism in the early 19th century. So it's a remarkable historical event, and it has tremendous implications for all of us in terms of our day-to-day economic lives over the next few years and decades. The precipitating agent that's responsible for this great economic transformation afoot is something called zero marginal cost. Now, don't be frightened. Marginal cost is the cost of producing an additional unit of a good or service once your fixed costs are covered. Let me explain. There's a paradox. deeply embedded in the heart of the capitalist system, previously undisclosed, even by Karl Marx, I should say. But this paradox has led to the great success of capitalism. Ironically, it's this very success that's now leading to its potential demise and this new economy that's emerging, the collaborative commons. In a capitalist market, sellers are always trying to find new technologies that can increase their productivity, reduce their marginal costs, so they can put out cheaper products, win over consumers, and bring some profits back to their investors. It's simply that no business person or economist ever anticipated in their wildest imagination a technology revolution so extreme